All right, folks. So I wanted to sort of start our course with an intellectual exercise on this question of okay, what's the real difference between novels and interconnected story collections? Now, obviously, not all novels are written as interconnected story collections. So sometimes it's really easy to tell when you are not reading an interconnected story collection because you might read something that overtly is chapter one, chapter two, chapter three, chapter four, in which it would not make sense to try to read a single chapter as a story isolated from the rest. Like there are novels where that's pretty obvious. But when I think about the texts we're going to read, and just to leap ahead, I have a list in the very last module of our course of some other recommended books that I think of when I think of interconnected story collections. Some of them are marketed as novels. So, if depending on the edition of A Visit from the Goon Squad that you have, for example, it may say on it a novel. And yet we are reading it in this course that is about writing interconnected story collections. If you look carefully at Jean Chen Ho's book, Fiona and Jane, this was an interesting choice. It doesn't say anything. Um, it doesn't say a novel. It doesn't say stories. It just says Fiona and Jane. So this question of like what makes something one or the other, how do I know if I'm writing a collection of short stories that are interconnected or if I'm writing a novel, is one of the things. I call it a central question here. I think it's something we'll be kind of thinking about with some regularity. Looking ahead to the discussion board, you may have already looked uh, where you'll be asked to describe your project. I described a project that I've recently finished that I'm kind of putting the finishing touches on that I would never call a novel. That is very much more a short story collection where the stories are connected to one another in some ways. But a current project is very much a novel in stories that I think of as a novel, and it's very tricky to like explicate in a very tangible way what the differences are. And part of that is there's not necessarily a good singular answer to what makes something a novel versus a story collection of interconnected stories. Now, you can also tell on the flip side with short story collections. I have read short story collections where I go, okay, this is a traditional short story collection where we leave one story and we've left that world behind and we move into another one, right? Where there's no overt quote unquote tangible connectivity between the two. And so there's not a single good answer to this question in either direction necessarily. But what are some of the things when I think of what distinguishes an interconnected story collection from a novel in stories is one way that you might think of this. Are a couple of things, possible answers that are not all going to be universally true for all things that are identified as novels. Because even as I was writing this list, I was thinking about A Visit from the Goon Squad, for example, and thought, well, it does this one, but it doesn't do this one. So where does it fall? Where does it not fall? So, for example, novels, I think, tend to have a sort of unified central narrative. So there is some relatively, I put the word easy in quotation marks, quote unquote, easy narrative thread or plot that you can say this is the central arc of this story. Um, for example, one of the books that's not on my list at the end is a great book called How High We Go in the Dark by a writer named Sequoia Nagamatsu that has a very unified central arc of um, scientists accidentally let loose a virus that has been like frozen in a cave for centuries, and unpleasant wackiness ensues for several centuries, right? But it is written in story form. As opposed to chapter one, chapter two, chapter three. So there's a unified central narrative there. I'll be curious to see what you all think about whether we can say there's a central narrative to either A Visit from the Goon Squad or Fiona and Jane. So we might think about these things I've proposed here when it comes to our texts, and you might think about how those might or might not apply to the projects you are working on. So novels, I think, typically are more likely to avoid radically different techniques and structures from story to story. So again, I'm already thinking of exceptions to this, but I would say a novel in stories is more likely to generally use similar style, similar structure, maybe feel like they were written by the same person, which I know is going to sound weird, but you'll understand what I mean when you read A Visit from the Goon Squad, where We sometimes move into radically different stylistic choices in that book. But then, funnily enough, Fiona and Jane, the one that is not marketed as a novel, I think actually fits this in the novel context a little bit more. But I think that when a writer is trying to write a novel in stories versus a collection of interconnected stories, they're more likely to write in the same modality throughout their stories. And then I think usually in a novel, some kind of central protagonist emerges. Excuse me. In a novel and stories, they may not appear in every single story, but they're going to be relatively, quote unquote, relatively easy to identify. Again, one of the texts that I've mentioned in my list at the end of the course, and even mentioned in the syllabus, is the book Olive Kitteridge. Well, it's named after Olive Kitteridge because she is the central figure in many ways, but also sometimes doesn't feel like she is. That's another book that is made to be called a novel on its cover, but may or may not be such. So these are just some of the things that I think of when I think of that. And then the last one, I would say that, and I'll explain what I mean by this, temporal chronology and geographic setting are typically more quote unquote normalized in novels. And so what I mean by that is in a novel and stories, you are more likely to see the stories organized chronologically. You're going to immediately figure out, and this is not a spoiler in any meaningful way, A Visit from the Goon Squad doesn't do that. But once you read A Visit from the Goon Squad, you might discover that that has to do with what Jennifer Egan is doing thematically. And so it might still fit as a novel. Fiona and Jane does follow a much more traditional, we start at the beginning of, when Fiona and Jane, the title characters, are young and we move with them through time. And the geographic setting is more what I mean by that is like more often than not, a novel in stories is going to take place in generally the same place. You may have some stories / chapters that move around geographically, but more often than not, there's a more homogenized sense of that in novels and stories. But again, I say that, and I'm immediately thinking of exceptions. I say that, and I'm immediately thinking of short story collections where the stories are interconnected, but they all take place in the same place. So, for example, the project that I described in the discussion board take place, again, I think of it as a short story collection, not a novel and stories. And it all kind of takes place around the same time in the same beachside town. So again, there are going to be these exceptions. And so at the end of the day, when we think about this question of is something a novel or is it a short story collection, it may not really matter. And I think for you in this class, don't worry too much about this larger question as you are working on your project. And I say this about all projects that people are working on. I tell people, don't worry about what it is until you get to the end. Like literally once you finished writing the thing. Don't worry about how you categorize something until it's done, because you don't want to push yourself into a particular box because you think, oh, I have to write it this way so it can be this thing. No, write the project you want to write and then figure out what it is you've written. The only real reason that you might care about what you're calling your thing is for marketing purposes. Novels sell, short story collections don't. You could easily make an argument that the reason that Jennifer Egan's book says a novel on the cover is because general readers are more likely to pick up a book that is identified as a novel than a short story collection. It's a tragedy, but it's reality. So this may not matter until you get to the point where you're trying to sell your book to a publisher, to an agent, and then they're trying to sell it to the general public. But it's worth thinking about. And so I'll be curious to see what you think of the two books we read, how your project may start by being identified as a short story collection of interconnected stories, and maybe it does or doesn't morph into a novel in stories. Anyway, so those are my thoughts, and I'll be curious to see what you think.